June 6, 1944, 05:35 hours. Whiterstands Nest 62, overlooking Omaha Beach. The pre-dawn light was a cold, liquid gray, blending the churning sea with the bruised sky. Gefreiter Franz Gockel, a 20-year-old machine gunner with the 352nd Infantry Division, shivered in the damp air of his concrete bunker. He wasn't cold from the weather. He was a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front, and the Norman Spring was mild by comparison. This was a different kind of chill, a deep, gnawing tension that had kept him and his comrades awake for days. His position, WN-62, was a masterpiece of interlocking fire, a concrete and steel web designed to pour a torrent of machine gun and mortar fire onto the beach below. He had been told, invincible. In the breast pocket of his Feldgrau tunic, he could feel the crinkled edges of a letter from his father in Westphalia. It spoke of mundane things: the neighbor's sow, a leaking roof, a meager potato harvest. It was a letter from a world that no longer seemed real. His world was this concrete aperture, the smell of ozone and damp earth, and the oily metallic weight of the MG-42 machine gun in his hands. He and his comrades had been fed a steady diet of propaganda. The invasion was coming, yes, but it would be a bloody repulse. Rommel's Atlantic Wall was impregnable. They expected commandos, perhaps paratroopers. They expected infantry and wooden boats. They were prepared for all of it. But as the light gathered, a low tectonic thrum vibrated through the bunker's floor. It was the sound of 1,000 engines. Gockel pressed his binoculars to the slit, his knuckles white. The sea, it was gone. An endless black armada, a ghost fleet, had materialized from the mist, stretching from horizon to horizon. A city of steel had appeared on their doorstep. Then the world exploded as the naval barrage began. Shells from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers tore into the bluffs. But Gockel and his comrades hunkered down, their faith in their concrete still intact. The real battle, they knew, would begin when the infantry hit the sand. What they didn't know, what no German plan had accounted for, was that the Americans had a secret. They were not just sending men, they were sending sea monsters. The problem for the Allied planners was brutal in its simplicity. Omaha Beach was a fortress. Unlike the other landing beaches, it was a concave crescent, dominated by steep 150-foot bluffs. On top of these bluffs, the Germans, specifically the combat-hardened 352nd Infantry Division, had built a series of mutually supporting strongpoints, the Whiterstands Nesten. These bunkers, bristling with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank cannons, were pre-sighted to turn the 300-yard tidal flat into a perfect killing zone. General Omar Bradley and his staff knew that the first waves of infantry, the 116th and 16th Regiments of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, would be rowing into a meat grinder. They would be pinned down and annihilated in minutes without immediate, overwhelming fire support. But destroyers couldn't get close enough to hit the bunkers, and the preliminary aerial bombardment, they would soon learn, had completely missed its targets due to cloud cover. The infantry needed armor. They needed tanks to be on the beach with the very first men, acting as mobile pillboxes, drawing fire, and blasting the concrete embrasures at point-blank range. The solution was one of the war's most bizarre and brilliant inventions, the duplex-drive Sherman tank, or DD tank. Part of a menagerie of specialist armor known as Hobart's Funnies, the DD tank was a standard 32-ton M4 Sherman fitted with a revolutionary and terrifying secret. A collapsible waterproof canvas screen could be erected around the hull, displacing enough water to make the tank buoyant. 2 propellers, powered by the tank's own engine, were mounted at the rear. It was in effect a swimming tank. The plan for Omaha was audacious. The U.S. 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions would launch their DD tanks from their landing craft, tank, LCTs, 2 to 3 miles offshore. They would swim to the beach, their 75mm guns ready, and crawl out of the surf at H-hour 0630, precisely as the first Higgins boats dropped their ramps. This was the secret. The Germans would not be fighting just men. They would be fighting tanks that emerged as if by black magic, from the sea itself. For the men of the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions, the morning of June 6th was a special kind of hell. Lieutenant Jim Barry, a 24-year-old tank commander in the 741st, sat in the commander's seat of his Sherman, Able. The massive diesel engine idled below him, its vibration the only sensation connecting him to the world. He was sealed inside a steel box, which was in turn sealed inside a swaying, flimsy canvas boat. The smell of diesel fumes, hydraulic fluid, and nervous vomit was suffocating. Through his small periscope, his only view of the outside world, he could see the gray, angry waves of the English Channel. The weather was far worse than predicted. The wind was a steady 20 knots and the swell was topping 6, even 8 feet. The DD tanks had been tested in the calm lakes of England, where they performed beautifully in 1-foot waves. This was a churning, violent sea. The order came down. Erect screens! The hydraulic system hissed, and the canvas wall rose around them, plunging the crew into a gloomy twilight. Now even Barry's limited vision was gone, replaced by a tiny patch of sky. He and his driver, a 19-year-old from Ohio, would have to navigate by compass and prayer. Then came the terrifying lurch as the LCT ramp dropped. "Driver, move out!" Barry's 32-ton tank rolled off the ramp and plunged into the sea. It didn't sink. Miraculously, it floated, a grotesque wallowing bathtub with a 75mm gun turret sticking out of the top. The freeboard, the distance between the water and the top of the canvas screen, was less than a foot. Every wave washed over the top, threatening to swamp them. The bilge pump strained, spitting a stream of seawater back into the ocean. The tank pitched and yawed violently. Barry could hear his crewmen being sick over the intercom. They were 3 miles from shore, moving at a glacial 4 knots. They were the secret weapon, but at that moment, they were just 5 terrified boys in a sinking iron coffin, praying they would live long to see the beach. Franz Gockel's confidence in WN-62 was not misplaced. It was a formidable position, armed with a 75mm anti-tank gun, 2 50mm anti-tank guns, mortars, and multiple MG-42s, all connected by trenches. More importantly, Gockel was not a conscript from a low-grade static division. He was a soldier of the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit hardened by 3 years of brutal combat against the Russians. Allied intelligence had tragically failed to detect the 352nd's recent move to the coast. The Allied plan for Omaha was predicated on facing the weak, non-motorized 716th Static Division, a unit made up of old men and young boys. Instead, the Americans were about to charge headlong into one of the Wehrmacht's best-trained formations. The German plan, drilled into Gockel by his Oberleutnant, was precise. Do not fire on the naval bombardment. Do not fire on the landing craft as they approach. Wait until the ramps drop. Wait until the Amerikaner are in the water, waist deep. Wait until they are fully on the tidal flat, in the pre-sighted open killing zone. Then, and only then, unleash everything. This doctrine was known as Feuereröffnung, opening fire. It was designed to maximize the psychological shock and lethality of their machine guns. Gockel's MG-42, the Hitler's buzzsaw, could fire 200 rounds per minute. He and his comrades expected a slaughter, and they were prepared to deliver it. Their anti-tank gunners, their POC 38s and 75mm cannons, were sighted on the single road exiting the beach. They expected tanks to come later, lumbering up the draws. Their entire defensive posture was based on the simple, logical assumption that men would come from the sea, and tanks would come from the land. At 0630, H-hour, the ramps on the first wave of Higgins boats dropped. Just as the German plan dictated, the beach erupted in a storm of machine gun and mortar fire. The first wave of the 116th Infantry was annihilated. Men were cut down in seconds, their bodies piling up at the water's edge. The sea turned red. From his bunker, Franz Gockel was firing in long, methodical bursts, the hot brass piling up around his feet. The plan was working. It was a shooting gallery, but then something impossible happened. The 741st Tank Battalion, supporting the 16th Infantry on the eastern half of the beach, had launched its tanks. The battalion commander, seeing the rough seas, had made a fateful decision to launch closer at 3,000 yards. It was still a catastrophe. Of the 32 tanks launched, 27 foundered and sank, taking their crews with them. Lieutenant Jim Barry's tank was one of them. A large wave tore the canvas, the engine flooded instantly, and the 32-ton machine plunged to the bottom. Barry and 2 of his crew managed to escape and inflate their life vests, but they were now just survivors, watching the battle from the water. But 5 tanks did make it. 5. For Franz Gockel, the sight defied all logic. While he was pouring fire into the infantry, he saw one of his comrades at the anti-tank gun shouting and pointing. Gockel swung his binoculars. Out in the surf, well beyond the chaos of the landing craft, was a Sherman tank. Water was streaming off its hull as it drove out of the sea. It had no landing craft. It just emerged, then another, and another. The shock was electric. For a moment, the German gunners faltered. Their entire plan had no contingency for this. Their anti-tank guns were sighted on the road, not the beach. Now they were frantically trying to traverse their cannons to engage these swimming monsters. The secret was out. At the same time, the LCTs carrying the 743rd Battalion, seeing the DD tanks foundering, courageously decided to ignore orders and drive their landing craft all the way to the beach, landing their tanks, without the screens, directly into the surf, under a hail of fire. Gockel watched in horror as one of the tanks, its 75mm gun already swiveling, fired a high-explosive shell. It slammed into the concrete casemate next to him. The bunker wasn't breached, but the aperture was shattered, and the men inside were stunned, their ears bleeding. The invincible fortress was suddenly in a one-on-one fight with a 32-ton steel beast that had just walked out of the ocean. The amphibious assault at Omaha Beach was an unmitigated disaster. The secret plan had failed. Over 27 tanks and their crews were lost to the sea before they had even fired a shot. The first wave of infantry, which was supposed to be supported by 64 tanks, hit the beach with almost none. This failure is the single biggest reason why the beach was named Bloody Omaha, and why the casualty rate was so catastrophic. But the unexpected outcome is this: the few tanks that did survive, the handful of DD tanks that made it ashore, and the non-amphibious tanks landed directly by their LCTs, were the only reason the landing wasn't a complete failure. They were the critical difference between a foothold and a total repulse. A single Sherman commanded by Sergeant P.R. Fuller of the 741st became a one-tank army. Pinned down with the infantry, Fuller methodically dueled with German strongpoints, firing shell after shell at the concrete bunkers, his tank drawing a tornado of enemy fire that would otherwise have been directed at the infantry. His actions and those of the other few surviving tanks became rallying points. They were the only heavy firepower the Americans had on the beach for the first, desperate hours. They were mobile armored pillboxes. When an infantry squad was pinned by an MG-42, a tank would crawl forward and silence it with a single 75mm shell. They were the big friends that gave men the courage to stand up and move. The Germans, shocked by their appearance, were forced to divide their fire, their anti-tank guns now frantically trying to kill the tanks instead of the infantry. The secret had failed in its plan, but in its concept it was the only thing that worked. The presence of just a handful of these machines provided the toehold from which the battle was eventually won. The psychological impact of the swimming tanks was profound on both sides. For the Germans, it was a moment of pure shock that shattered their sense of security. Their entire defense was based on a solid, predictable understanding of warfare. The beach was a static barrier. But the DD tanks represented a paradigm shift. They were a technological marvel that broke the rules. If tanks could swim, what couldn't the Allies do? This technological surprise, this Wunderwaffe in reverse, created doubt and fear. The concrete wall suddenly felt very thin. For Gefreiter Gockel, the battle for WN-62 turned from a turkey shoot into a desperate fight for survival. His bunker was now the primary target of a tank that had simply crawled from the sea. The 75mm shells, while not penetrating the thickest concrete, were blasting the firing embrasures to pieces, sending shards of concrete and steel spalling through the interior. The concussion was unbearable. The invincible strongpoint was being systematically blinded and deafened. The psychological dominance the Germans had held at 0630 was completely broken by 080 RARs. For the American infantry, the psychological effect was the exact opposite. Men who were cowering behind the shingle, disorganized, leaderless, and on the verge of panic saw a lifeline. The sound of a Sherman's 75mm gun firing inland was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was a beacon of hope. It was proof that they were not alone. It was the anchor around which men like Colonel George Taylor and General Norman Cota could rally their scattered troops and begin the agonizing, bloody climb up the bluffs. The few tanks that survived the swim had saved the entire invasion from psychological collapse. The battle for Omaha Beach raged for the entire day. By nightfall, the Americans had a tenuous foothold, barely a mile deep. The cost was staggering, over 2,400 casualties on a single beach. The crews of the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions who drowned, trapped in their iron coffins at the bottom of the English Channel, were among the first and most tragic heroes of D-Day. Their sacrifice, born from the failure of the secret plan, paid for the beach in blood. But the story of the duplex drive tank is not one of failure. On the other 4 D-Day beaches, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the seas were calmer and the launches were more successful. On the British and Canadian beaches, hundreds of DD tanks swam ashore as planned, providing that critical on-time fire support. Their success is a major reason why the casualty rates on those beaches were a fraction of what they were at Omaha. The secret of Omaha Beach, the one the Germans were shocked to discover, was that the very ocean they believed was their greatest defense was, in fact, an Allied invasion route, not just for boats, but for tanks. The shock Gefreiter Gockel and his comrades felt when they saw a Sherman emerge from the waves was the shock of a new kind of war. It was a technological gamble of the highest order. At Omaha, the gamble failed and men paid the price. But the few that survived the gamble, the 5 swimming tanks and the handful landed directly, were the fulcrum on which the entire invasion of France pivoted from catastrophic failure to agonizing, bloody success. They were the secret that, even in its failure, tipped the balance.